Mrs. Flick, ladies and gentlemen, nobody will contest that we are now in a new geopolitical situation. The Atlantic world order, which has been in existence for 70 years, is fading away under the generally, say, soft hegemony of the United States. A characteristic process of internationalization has developed since 1945. International organizations, the UN, EU, ASEAN, IWF, NATO, WTO, OECD, up until the international courts of law, mark the world of supranational politics. And here the old power states were asked, or could be asked, to do their duty. And the existing national primary spaces of what is political has been moderated and structured by an increasingly dense connection or network of contracts and international organizations. The absolute sovereignty claim, which exists in theory, but nevertheless has never been, been used in practice, has now been relativized by the principle of mutual commitment. Here, on international conferences or European Council meetings, certain joint targets have been worded. Certain agreements were made, compromises were made. It was all about guaranteeing opening trade paths and fair trade conditions, currency and economic questions, joint peacekeeping, and the cross-border actions, the consequences of wars. Then there were other cross-border topics like armament control, education, fighting epidemics, and of course, giving food to the world. And all this together led to a suprastate or supranational agenda. And I can say that for decades, the institutions of a global government has, stabilized. And after the end of the Cold War, it looked like as if global government is not only a technically cool description of an intergovernmental, interstate conference and negotiation culture, but is also capable of creating a kind of world government and therefore, starting or ushering in the end of the states as determining subjects of history. And I can say this is the end of states, as I said, determining history. Now, the thinker of late Enlightenment, Immanuel Kant, in his philosophical draft about eternal peace, brought together the two parts of civilized state connections or commitments and a uniform world republic. He worked at a concept and he tried to work out what all this means. Thomas Hobbes, talked about and justified the modern absolutist state of the 17th century, which means he legitimized it using the picture of a human being in its natural state, in which everyone is the next one's enemy and always the right of the stronger will prevail, meaning there's no law, no right. Now, freedom, if you look at this, and if you say that all this would mean that a kind of monopoly of violence or force will happen. Now, Kant, this was towards the end of the 18th century, says that, and he is now working on a higher level, he uses this for describing states. And here, Mrs. Flick just mentioned civilizing the states. This is exactly the project which was mentioned then, meaning in a world where the right of the stronger is prevailing or is dominating, then this will be expressed by the right to war, the jus ad bellum, the process of civilizing states, meaning the law and the right, and all this is to be implemented. Now, civilizing states, and this including the ban on violence, like you will find in the UN Charter, means that justice will be created and respective warranties and guarantees will be created. But Immanuel Kant did not take things higher one level, i.e. from the world of the individuals to a world of the states. You know, the Königsberg philosopher, I know he now is suspected to have been a racist, but this is something which should not, irritate us now. This master philosopher thought better than the state practitioner Hobbes. You know, Kant, in contrast to Hobbes, stayed, or if Kant had stayed true to this idea of the higher level, then, of course, he would have to demand a world Leviathan. And this is exactly what Kant did not do. Although he sees the substance of the world's citizen, and this as a right for each and every person, he believed that the war between states, and of course he didn't know the 20th century wars, he thought that the war between states might be the lesser evil in comparison with a world state. A world state which has got the necessary distance to all specific livelihoods, and also in view of the right of political communities. And here I would like to quote Kant. He considered this world state a kind of soulless despotism, and this is how I quote Kant. But nevertheless, since the 1990s, we've seen an internationally intellectual elite, and they've been working on a project of denationalization and the denationing, if you like, or denationalization in favor of, governing with all your power, with all your strength. And for some, people who just have some funny ideas, here the foreign politicians, the diplomats, the intellectuals, the entrepreneurs, the NGOs, the scientific councils, the civil servants of the EU Commission, as well as the OECD experts and other political foundations and judges of international courts of law have been seen as a network of secret societies. And this is exactly what the, aficionados of absolutism, kingdoms, as well as other states, like the Freemasons, were thinking. So, and of course, every conspiracy theory is to be seen in this context. Now, what I can say is that what has been in existence over the last 10 years is an understanding and a well-meant cosmopolitical common sense, according to which each and every state is just each and every step in supranational commitments is justified because of the dangers of new power state atavism. So every mechanism or every, state integration was good, like what Hobbes thought, and there was something which was to be prevented. And of course, it was the, commandment of reasoning. And this means every mechanism of integrating states was good. Each and every reinforcement of mutual interrelationships was considered to be positive. And at the end of a negotiation marathon in Brussels, the state president Macron could say that they have now stepped into, the domain of joint indebtedness, and he was able to justify it not as a necessary evil, but as a historical step, or celebrated it as such, because it meant that a new community of solidarity has been created. Now, the constraints of past integration steps which are considered to be as steps of denationalization, like the currency union or the common asylum policy, now develop an impact which are like a burden as a kind of delimiting pressure on institutions, the democracy, parliamentary budget right, stability of currencies, or the financial markets. The architects of supranational areas, for good reasons, considered themselves to be representatives of enlightenment and pioneers of universal human rights and global welfare requirements. But today, they face reactive forces, opposing forces, and of course I'm going to talk about them in a minute. But who were the actors of this unilateral world order which seems to come unhinged? The most important actors on this stage were diplomats of the states, but also international scientific organizations, globally operating companies, private assistance funds, economic lobbyists, and political non-government organizations, NGOs. And the great process of globalization took place within this framework, which stabilized after some time and became a matter of fact. And under the conditions of the Cold War, this unilateral order has always been precarious. Because, the Cold War and the antagonism of the two systems, we always saw changes or deformations of it. But the rituals and the behavioral standards, meant that there is a linear trend to be seen over decades. In sociological and also in psychological terms, we see evidence that a cosmopolitan elite emerged who, in their respective states and in their respective cultural spaces, were seen and considered themselves as progressive, and also made sure that the government or the nation does not become too powerful. And, using new rational corporations and forming and writing new rules, this is what they stood for. The basic law, the German basic law, focused on this cooperation between nations, and they expanded it to international cooperation, particularly in Europe. But history is hardly ever linear. It is not always moving on a path which is characterized by reason. There has been the trend and tendency to internationalize, and there was also a trend to resilience, i.e. this, persistence, the stamina of local and, regional domains of power. Now, if you look at the history, and this might be a problem when doing so, that even the best, the most rational concepts will create opposing forces, irrational opposing forces. If they are strong enough, they might be able to take us away from the path of progress. And if you think of some of the years in the 20th century, then you will understand what I mean. Also, particularly at the end of the 20th century. It is always necessary that we accept institutions, because if somebody sees a state only against the backdrop of world wars and as danger to peace, and, thinks that they are only general welfare targets, this person will overlook the potential of this new modern way of governing, which is still the basis of many international connections. The institution of a new state took into account the complexity of the political system and reduced this complexity. The Holy Roman Empire has been as complex as the European Union today. So, when looking at a modern state, as a concept of reasoning, of rational thinking, then it has been a reduction of complexities. Now, reducing complexities, then we've got the civil servants, complex rights, and also the belief in technical, social progress. Now, all these are hallmarks of a modern state, particularly the one based on the rule of law. And because of all this, an institution emerged which will also, say, be seen as an agent which the majority of our population could accept. I know that some of the sociologists will not accept this view, but nevertheless, it was an important institution having a certain impact, and it created legitimacy for those in power. Because here we find a center because of the volonté générale of the citizens and their ongoing approval of what is being done. It is legitimized, and particularly after 1945, there was an opening of states, inwards and outwards. And this opening process increased against the backdrop of all advantages, cooperation, economic advantages, the advantages of an open trading state. But nevertheless, the complexity became larger. The complexity of the political situation. Now, this had an impact on liberal societies, and their outward confederation, you might say, particularly in a supranational Europe, then was not able to fight any, say, regionalization trends. But I can say, if you take into account today's situation, then of course politics becomes very, very difficult. And if you think about it, some of the actions today reminds you of things which happened in the past. The basic new order of the European Union, or changing the American electoral system, is as simple as an old economic reform in ancient China, or the change of specific aspects in the Holy Roman Empire. Here we need checks and balances in horizontal and vertical terms, and then subdividing everything into, say, national and regional or even local systems. And, when you look at the United States, that you will see breaking up these systems. On the one hand, we can say that a lot of things have been globalized, and at the same time, the state is focusing on human rights, on well-being, climate protection, etc., etc. And at the same time, it is, focusing on a well-being agenda. But if you look at other states, then you might say, in rational terms, maybe even locally or regionally, another state might be provincial, might be, say, fragmented. There might be different experiential spaces. And if you read the English press, then you know what I'm talking about. There is a national space is completely focusing on itself, but that's the UK. But if you look at Germany, the situation might be the same. But, we see a cosmopolitan world, but nevertheless we treat them in a very parochial manner, in a very local manner. This will also create a considerable, say, disruption of public life. And also certain ambitions will create a lot of problems. And if you look at the reality and judging the reality, this view, the respective opinions will all disappear, because it's not easy to do so. Looking at regulations, look at rules and use them, control a nation, and maybe even transform it using fiscal, interference in order to fight certain crises. And all this led to over-regulation and a hybridization of the financial and the fiscal economies. That was the result. And the old system, the banking system, or the central bank policies, they all have reached their limits now. And this unlimiting pressure is not only found in Europe, but also in Japan, Brazil, North America. Politics in a meaningful, rational, reasonable way does not mean there is legislation or, the enforcement of the laws. No, political domination and power happens in an open, networked communication process through which certain targets are being debated, and only at the end of a long process it will mean that obedience is demanded. The climate protection, conference discusses issues whether or not the 2-degree target by the end of the century is a project which is reasonable, which can find consensus, and then once it has been agreed upon, international institutions and governments will look at them and will undertake, at least in an ideal case, they will undertake to put this into national law, or they find other ways like the emission trading system. So this kind of reasoning pursues such major projects, and at the same time, we're looking at the facts themselves. It feels legitimized by the tellers of history, so by the purpose, the final purpose of such a system. If you look at the oppression of women in backward societies, infant mortality, global warming and its consequences, those fighting that, they seem to be legitimized in factual terms. If you look at the legitimacy of, international connections, suddenly the legitimacy of international projects were coming to the fore, and also institutions like the WHO. They have been given legitimacy. International organizations are then, watched, monitored by experts, by NGOs, or private foundations like the one of Linda and Bill Gates. So they follow this. Now, instead of the diplomatic meeting, we had a space of communication and actions which was used to, exert influence on governments forming their wills. And of course, when looking at anticipating nations, particularly when it comes to helping out populations starving or other catastrophes, they all try to work together. Now, this world constellation, after the end of the Cold War, was considered to be an uncontested matrix of a world order. Republican spirit was wafting through the intellectuals and was coming up with new interpretation. The distribution of the World Wide Web, of course, also seemed to usher in a technological and political new development, but somehow a kind of coincidence. Al Gore said that this is a digital agora, that is the dream of a global democracy. New forms of participation seem to be possible. Now, if you think of the categories, everything else, was considered to be obsolete. Even the old democracies, like the English democracy, were considered to be kind of spaces or domains for order, which are bound by institutions, by laws. And the worldwide network seemed to be the pinnacle, the cornerstone of such a development. The beginning of the second half of the century, we've seen the Arabic Spring. And here we have seen the revolution, the uprising of young people, and they agreed on that using the new media, and demonstrations in Hong Kong, also mainly by young people. Now, I believe they were the epitome of the digital agora, and this meant that they made the power, requirements or demands were considered to be obsolete. But if you look at that from today's perspective, then, of course, nothing has happened. Just thinking about the millions of smartphones these young people were lifting up. As I said, this old order has reached its limits. What we experience today is a rebellion against this order. And it is a counter-revolution which has to be taken seriously. And against this backdrop, a new geopolitical constellation occurs. China has never really accepted the transatlantic order as a condition for its own uprising or coming to power, economic rising. It just accepted it, but never wanted to be a part of it. Ancient China, the one which, disappeared in the 20th century, was a Sino-centric empire. And in this case, it saw its neighbors as vassals only, where the Europeans, with their trading principles and the principles of states on a level playing field, arrived in China. Then they concluded contracts and agreements with China, which China still finds like a sore wound in their history. And if you think of the situation of the Tiananmen Square in 1989, that was a clear signal, and how the Chinese government responded. It was a clear signal that China does not want to democratize and will certainly not accept its her integration into such international, commitments. Well, we expected it. It does not speak against us. But, the reality has shown that our ideas were wrong. In China, it's all about harmony. It's about reputation. It's about self-assertion of their own polities, if you like. And the more powerful the country, and the more the United States are just putting at risk their own hegemonial position, and the more China rises to power, the clearer and the more the positions of geopolitical power mechanics are changing. Since Putin, since the autocratic and neo-Osman policy of Erdogan in Turkey, since then, we can see that the number of those opposing the West is on the increase. This means we are now having a multipolar world. Western democracies, too, are losing their strength in the inside, which made them strong during times of the Cold War. The United States, torn between pieces, right and left. And this means, by whatever happens, the bipartisan policy, like American First, etc., this is outside. On the inside, however, the ditches, the gaps between people grows wider. And then take back control. That was said in the context of the Brexit referendum. And here you see that some people, and maybe, the others outside England thought that this is a typical British spleen, and they thought that this was a political, influencing of the referendum. But it also means that this country will leave the safe path of reasoning. But those voting for Brexit, wanted to get back their own democratic self-assertion and really opposed an increasingly closer union with the EU. And this also meant that they turned down another project which has been developed under or with the cooperation of the United Kingdom, and now they reach the crossroads. Continue, or, put your head in the sand like the notorious ostrich. Those who really believe that global projects are to be taken serious has to accept one condition of each and every political action. Moral and factual discourses are always bound to international context. Those who have a very well-founded position and defends it uncompromisingly deserves respect. But if this person defends this position in such a way that the institutions of social market economy and democracy are violated, then of course they will violate the principles of democracy. There are very good reasons to demand getting away from coal-fired power stations, but there's no reason whatsoever to start becoming violent against policemen. The wrath the anger of young people against the climate policy which is going wrong, this is legitimate. But saying that an entire generation failed or that the parliamentarism has been undermined by such and such is really, interfering with our democracy. The majority of the citizens had a critical opinion when it comes to opening borders. And, you might be against it, but other and opposing opinions have to be debated and have to be tolerated because the, say, a moral response is be given. Those calling for hatred, those calling for violence loses the respect of the state under the rule of law. But the debates must be done in an open manner without, trying and making the person with another opinion to an enemy, an adversary, immediately. The paralyzing bipartisan camp-based thinking has to be avoided. You have to think about developing a new culture of debate. The new constellation, the new geopolitical constellation is forcing us to start rethinking. Democracies have to invest themselves more in order to keep up the vitality and the functionality of their states and their political cultures. So when it comes to human rights, when it comes to the collective goods of mankind, can be supported and might be able to create counterweights against other developments. So we must be ready to rethink. And by doing so, by accepting this, the institutions will be taken much more serious in like in the past. And, the institutions and their developments, they will contain the wisdom of centuries. And, this is something which we need for world peace, and this is not only what Kant said. The social market economy and is far better than any, say, state-ruled command economy. We cannot say that freedom is possible under such a command economy. The American independence and John Locke, you cannot say that you can replace freedom against security or security to be replaced by peace. This is not possible. When looking at institutions, the nation under the rule of law, the independence of the law courts is as important as the respect for civil servants who really put democracy in the respective people. Police, fire brigades, paramedics are important. They do an important job, but they can expect protection when they are attacked. And a country losing this respect and fails to help them loses an important aspect. We must have the possibility and capability to put things into context. Those who want to have lasting democracy, sustainable economics, will not only invest in climate protection, but also will come up with a balanced budget. And, the responsibility for the budget will not or should not be dissolved in kind of offering, debentures to everyone. And doing it like this would mean you just dissolve sugar cubes in a cup of tea. Social integration, education, investing it means this is important for solidarity, a community based on solidarity. Human rights, which everyone is entitled to do, are the double band of a double helix. There's one band, and the other band is the joint political freedom, the sovereignty of the people, and self-determination. And both these two bands of this helix is embodied in a nation under the rule of law. The individual self-development and self-determination of the community They are not identical, but they are part and parcel of the two sides of the coin. And, this might lead to a new geopolitical situation, which at the end of the day might, end in a new peaceful world order. Thank you.